Hi, I'm Leela, one half of Now What Pottery Works, and I'm here today with a tutorial on how to throw cylinders. Cylinders are one of the most important forms you learn to throw because cylinders are the starting point for a good number of other forms. Forms like cups, bowls, vases, bottles, they all start as cylinders, and if you can't throw a good cylinder, you're going to have a hard time throwing these other things. So the first thing you see me doing in this video is wedging. Wedging is really important to get rid of any air bubbles and make your clay the same consistency throughout, give it a uniform feel. What I'm doing here is called a spiral wedge. I'm going to be doing a video on the different kinds of wedging and how to do them correctly in a future video. So I'm going to spiral wedge for a couple of minutes until I've made my way through all of this clay so that it's as uniform and consistent as I can get. And from that point, I am then going to start weighing out my balls of clay. I'm going to be throwing with about 1 pound balls of clay for today's video. I like 1 pound for throwing cylinders because it's a decent amount, but not too small. I feel like it's really important to weigh out your clay because it gives you a more consistent result. When you know exactly how much clay you have, you're able to push your clay farther and make it work for you more. After I've weighed out my 1 pound balls of clay, I'm going to wedge them. I've also weighed out a couple other weights here because I was going to throw some other stuff at the same time. But I'm using a method here called the ram's head, and I'm going to wedge each ball individually to make sure that it is free of air bubbles and nice and smooth. When I wedge, I kind of like to create a bit of a cylinder rather than a ball. I find a cylinder shape is easier to get to attach to the wheel head nicely with less issues. So I've formed all of these into kind of a long cylinder with a rounded bottom. Now that we're done wedging, we're going to move over to the wheel. The very first thing you want to do with the wheel is get your clay thoroughly attached to the wheel head. To do this, you want to kind of set your clay down pretty hard in the center of your wheel and slowly start patting as the wheel spins just a little bit. You're going to pat fairly forcefully so that you form a bit of a cone shape. Once I've got my clay nice and attached, I'm going to get my wheel moving up to the speed I would like to throw at, and I'm going to get my hands and clay wet. Not so wet that they are saturated, but wet enough that my hands will not stick to the clay. And then I'm going to begin coning. Coning is the process of creating a cone shape. By creating this cone shape, you are evening out the moisture levels of your clay, helping to start align the particles so that you can center a bit more easily. And if there are any air bubbles left over from your wedging, you can also get rid of them here. To start coning, you're going to place your damp hands on either side of the clay, applying even but firm pressure and a slight squeezing and upward motion. You have to make sure that you're providing enough pressure that you're not just moving the surface level of the clay and creating a volcano, that you're applying even pressure so that the clay starts to balloon up through the center of your hands. As the clay balloons up in between your hands as you're coning, you're going to follow that up with your hands so that you're staying at the top of the bit of clay. Once you have that cone shape, you're going to want to start bringing that clay back down to form a puck and center your clay. To do this, start at the top of the cone and put one hand on one side and the other at the top. And with the top hand, bend the clay slightly at an angle and start to push down and into your other hand. Doing this will allow the clay to start to center and form the puck you need to start opening the clay. You can then adjust the puck to be more centered if need be by applying steady firm pressure at an angle supported by your other hand, very similar to as if you were coning down. If it's not centered enough, you can also cone again. You can repeat this coning process as many times as you need to get your clay centered. I do it 3 times in this video, but normally I only do it once or twice. The most important part of this stage is making sure that your clay is completely centered. That's the whole goal of coning. If your clay isn't centered, you're not going to be able to open well. This is the stage where you'll feel any air bubbles if you wedged incorrectly. This is the stage where you can correct these most easily, and it'll help you keep nice, even walls when it comes time to do the pulling stage. Now that your puck of clay is centered, it's time to start opening. I've taken my knuckle here to clean up the edge of my puck to make sure there's no little excess bit of clay that's not really integrated into the puck very well. And then I'm wetting my hands thoroughly because opening can be sticky. Opening is the process of creating the hole in the center of your clay so that you can have a finger on either side to make pulls. I like to open using my pointer fingers. I take one finger and place it in the center of the puck and support it with my other pointer finger and start to press into the center of the clay, creating a well, almost all the way to the wheel head, leaving about 1/8 of an inch at the bottom. After opening, the next step is to widen the opening of your puck a little bit. To do this, you're going to make sure your fingers are damp. You're going to take your fingertip or tips, you can do this with one finger or more, and you're going to drag your fingertip along the bottom of the clay, allowing the rest of your finger to come in contact with the side and pull towards you, which will widen out your puck of clay. The next thing to do is to start to thin out the walls of your puck and bring them up. This is called making a pull. This first pull that I make is really just a smoothing and thinning out of the wall, but isn't really a true pull. I'm using the knuckle on my outside hand and my pointer and second finger on my left hand to slowly squeeze the clay together and up. To make our first real pull, I'm going to press out with my inner fingers to allow a little divot to form and take that divot and put my finger underneath it with my right and outside hand. I'm then going to slowly lift that little divot and that little lump of clay up in between my fingers. As you do this, you're stretching the clay and making a pull. Your clay will start to get taller and you'll thin it out as you do this. It's really important that after every pull, you address the lip of your pot, which means to kind of smooth it over with your finger or to smooth it over with your sponge. This keeps it from being different heights and kind of keeps that rim even and flat. It's also important throughout this process that you're keeping the walls of your pot damp so that your fingers don't stick. So you see me periodically dipping my fingers back into my bucket of water, but I'm also trying not to oversaturate my clay and make it too wet because it will start to fall apart. You will repeat that pulling action until you've reached the desired height and or thickness of your clay. So at this point, I've reached the height I'd like to be at with this amount of clay, but it's not a perfect cylinder. It's flared out at the rim a little bit. What I'm going to do is wet my hands and the clay and do a process called collaring. So I'm going to take my hands on either side towards the base of the clay and start to squeeze them together. There's no pressure downward at this point. I'm going to squeeze slowly together and move my hands up the clay. And when I reach towards the lip and I can touch the lip of the clay, I'm going to hook a finger over that to help steady the rim so that as I squeeze together, I'm not also knocking that out of center or creating a ripple. You can repeat this step as many times as you need to get your walls as straight as possible. This step isn't necessary for everyone, but I am using a throwing stick here to smooth the bottom of my cylinder out and get it completely flat. I'm just inserting the throwing stick and using the flat bottom to drag across the base, which will make that bottom pit completely flat and eliminate any lumps, bumps, or any ridges I put in with my finger. After I'm finished with the throwing stick, the next step is to take a sponge, wring out any water, and reach down into the bottom of the cylinder to remove any excess water down there. Leaving it could cause the cylinder to crack later. I also took this time to take that same sponge and wipe off any extra water from the wheel head, but it isn't necessary to do at this stage if you don't want to. After using the sponge, it's also important to collar again to get your pot recentered. I'm now going to be using a rib to clean up the bottom edge of the cylinder as well as to finish shaping it and get all of the excess water and slip off the outside of the pot. I focus on the bottom of the cylinder for a little while there because I'm not trimming this. So using my rib, I'm able to kind of make a little cut underneath, which makes it easier for the wire tool to slide underneath, and it also takes off a little bit of excess material. Next, I take that same rib and hold it at an angle to the pot, support the inside, slowly press the rib against the pot and my hand, and slowly move that upwards, which will center and smooth the outside edge as well as remove all of the water. I want to remove all of the water and slip from the outside surface so I can pick the pot up off the wheel. To do this, I dry my hands off and get ready to cut the pot off of the wheel with my wire tool. Now, stopping the wheel, I'm going to take my wire tool and hold it taut and slide it underneath the base of the pot. Normally, this is when you would be able to take this piece and set it on a board, but here I'm going to set it directly on top of my wire tool because I'm going to cut it in half so you can see what it looks like. When you're learning to throw, it's really important to do this so you can evaluate yourself, and it can be hard to tell what you're feeling from the inside. When you cut it in half, you can visually see how well you threw your piece. So here I'm cutting the piece in half and you can see how even the walls are. The goal is to have the wall of your piece be even all the way down if you're throwing without the intent to trim afterwards. So here's what this looks like on the cylinder that I've thrown. So the walls on the cylinder are slightly thinner at the top than they are at the base, but overall are pretty even. This is a good goal when you're learning to throw. If you're planning on trimming, you'll want to throw a little bit different than that, but this is how you throw no trim cylinders. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and subscribe for some more videos.